All right, guys. As I told you in class today, we're a little bit behind, so I'm going to kind of press the issue. And then, of course, I just realized that we won't have class on Wednesday because 18 out of 20 of you guys will be taking the PSATs. So today we got to get through Reformers, and then tomorrow we'll talk a little bit about it. We'll go over it and then jump right into Manifest Destiny. All right, there is a worksheet attached on Edmodo that you can use with this, that I suggest using with this, that helps break down each section. There's going to be two parts to this. The first three are going to be, probably 15 minutes, and the second 5 or 6 segments are going to be a total about maybe another 15 to 20 minutes. All right, but we're talking about antebellum revivalism and reform. All right, understand at this point in American history, there's a couple of issues. All right, one, there's a feeling of a spiritual breakdown within society. All right, and with that, or separate from that, is industrialization, which kind of creates this dehumanizing, monotonous life. All right, there's a economic and social dislocation with the influx of immigrants, and the spreading out the movement of people westward, and things like that. So America, even though we're creating this identity for ourselves, there are also some issues. All right, and as I said in class today, this is the time period of America's first progressive movement. All right, so when we talk about antebellum America and how we go about solving these issues, whether they're from industrialization or just this spiritual breakdown in society, there's two main areas. You have the Second Great Awakening, and then you have transcendentalism. Okay, and then together, those two areas are going to bring about a series of reforms. All right, and these reforms are going to create all these different movements and societies and reform eras, but the whole focus is on redefining the ideals of equality. All right, how do we redefine equality in America at this time period? Okay, we're going to go rather quickly, but the Second Great Awakening isn't much different than the first. It's exactly what it says. It's this Great Awakening, this spiritual reform from within. Okay, and so when we talk about this, we're talking about this, personal reform, and here are the areas that they're going to try to attack. Temperance, meaning alcohol, the asylum or penal reform, abolitionism, women's rights, education, etc. All right, and they're going to address each of these areas through the Second Great Awakening, so to again redefine the ideals of equality. Okay, now we mentioned this person's name before, but Alex de Tocqueville, he had this great insight on America's religion, and he says, in France, I had almost always seen the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom pursuing courses diametrically opposed of each other. But in America, he finds that religion and freedom are together. All right, they're combined. Religion was the foremost of the political institutions of the United States, which is interesting considering we have separation of church and state. All right, but obviously popular religion is very important. Okay, and it leads to this pursuit of perfection. From this time period of the antebellum era here, we have what's called the benevolent empire. All right, and what you see in the north, in New York, all right, here up in Utica, in Rochester, and Buffalo, are what we call these burned over districts. All right, and all these lines represent the movements of revivals of the Second Great Awakening. So you can see that a lot of times these revivals are going to go along the railroad, and that's one of the impacts of the railroad. Obviously, it also spreads ideas such as the Second Great Awakening. All right, but in New York, upstate New York, you have these burned over districts. They call them burned over districts, obviously, because if you remember to the First Great Awakening, they have these revivals with these bonfires and their outdoor circus-like events, but they're all focused on religion. And you see all the different colored dots represent different religious groups that are going to be formed and that are going to take part from the Second Great Awakening. Okay. Again, here's just a depiction of an outdoor revival movement. Okay. All right, Charles G. Finney is going to be the leader of this soul-shaking conversion, and he talks about the range of tents and fires reflecting lights and people singing and shouting, and the powers of contemplation, and how the spirit of the Jesus is going to run through you. Hallelujah! That crazy feeling of religion, all right, that he's going to bring forth. All right. One of the groups that comes out of the Second Great Awakening, though, is the Mormons. Or I shouldn't necessarily say they come out of it, but they definitely take light during this time period. Joseph Smith is the founder of the Mormons, and he writes what's called the Golden Tablets and then the Book of Mormon. All right. Eventually, in Illinois, Joseph Smith is going to be murdered for having these what were considered to be crazy ideas. All right, the idea of Mormonism is very different at this time period. I guess that's the best way to put it. And his whole thing is he wanted to create new and more ordered society through his Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And again, he begins upstate New York and eventually spreads to Illinois. And some of the ideas that led to his death are the ideas of polygamy, being with many wives or having many wives. I don't think I could, take more than one. Lord knows one is enough for many men. Really, there's this big sense of secrecy surrounding his community that caused people to fear them. After Joseph Smith is killed, a gentleman named Brigham Young is going to lead the exodus of the Mormons from Illinois all the way to Salt Lake City, Utah. All right. Again, there's a strict belief in human perfectibility, not individual liberty. The Mormons were very organized, centrally directed society. It was like a refuge from disorder and insecurity in the secular world. Okay. All right. Again, here's Brigham Young. Now, another group during this revivalist movement is the Shakers. All right, the Shakers were kind of those religious groups that felt the Spirit through you, and therefore that's why they were called the Shakers, because they constantly shook and felt like there was something in them. These people were part of what we call the New Light. All right, Charles Finney's revivalist movement, which included the Shakers, were called the New Lights, versus the First Great Awakening were called the Old Lights. All right. And here are just some good quotes to help identify. Remember the cries of those who are in need and trouble, and that when you're in trouble, God may hear your cries. So again, they were very loud, boisterous. A lot of high energy, all right, in their worship. Okay. Again, here's a painting of a Shaker meeting, a good Shaker hymn. All right. They lived very, very simple lives. All right. All right. Now, the second area, as I said, that is going to take up this attempt to reform society is transcendentalism. And I hope you remember this, obviously, from English or from world history. But transcendentalism becomes out of the European Romanticism of the time period. Okay, there's this liberation of understanding and this cultivation of reasoning. Okay, that's where the word transcendentalism comes from. They want to transcend the limits of intellect and allow the emotions, the soul, to create an original relationship with the universe. All right, when we talk about transcendentalist thinking, there's this idea that, again, man must acknowledge a body of moral truths that were intuitive and must transcend more sensational proof. Okay, one, there's this belief that there's an infinite benevolence of God. Okay, there's infinite benevolence of nature, the divinity of man. And so those are like the three kind of truths that people must accept in order to transcend themselves. Okay. Transcendentalists instinctively rejected all secular authority, meaning like the development of church. When we talk about secular, we're talking about the church organizations. Okay. They also rejected the authority of organized churches and scriptures of laws or conventions. Okay. Many of these transcendentalists came from New England, and there's this belief or this focus on the distinction between reason and inner capacity to grasp beauty and emotional expression versus understanding. So it's reason versus understanding. All right. And the goal here is to cultivate reasoning. Again, he says, therefore, if man was divine, it would be wicked that he should be held in slavery. So you can already see this connection of transcendentalism used to argue against slavery. All right. He says, thus the role of the reformer was to restore man to that divinity which God had endowed him. All right. Most of transcendentalism is going to be centered around Ralph Waldo Emerson. All right, and again, he's from Concord, Massachusetts. I hope you read some of his. And he writes, for example, the essays on nature in 1832, that argued self-fulfillment through a commune with nature. He also writes a very important one called Self-Reliance, that called for individual fully to explore the inner capacities, this unity with the universe. All right. He also has a very famous lecture called The American Scholar, which argued that beauty from instinct versus learning. Therefore, Americans should still have artistic greatness. All right. So, he's really looking at beauty as in the eye of the beholder, and not necessarily a learned beauty, a sense of beauty. Okay. One of his leading pupils or supporters is Henry David Thoreau. And his main book is Walden, obviously, where he writes it where he's, out on the pond by himself. And then he also writes the Resistance to Civil Disobedience. Okay. Now, he believed that people should seek self-realization by not conforming to society's expectations and responding to your own instincts. In Walden, for example, he's living the simple life in the woods, because he doesn't want to conform to society's expectations. In the Resistance to Civil Government, he's talking about how government that requires violation of personal morality is not legitimate. And again, that's going to be used with slavery. Okay. Now, their agenda obviously is to give freedom to the slave, to give well-being to the poor and the miserable, to give learning to the ignorant. Okay. And they want to give health to the sick. Very, very socialist mindset. Okay. Give peace and justice to society. One of the critics of transcendentalism is Nathaniel Hawthorne. And basically what he says is that their pursuit of the ideal led to a distorted view of human nature and possibilities. One should accept the world as an imperfect place, which has truth. Therefore, he writes books such as The Scarlet Letter, where the wife commits adultery, and The House of Seven Gables. All right. Now, what comes out of transcendentalism is, are these utopian communities. Okay. These utopian communities want to create a sense of community in an increasingly impersonal society. All right, and you could already see some of them, the Floraites, the Owenites, and Oneida. We'll talk about each of those here in a second. All right, the Oneida community, created by John Humphrey Noyes. He was a Millerite, which is another type of religion during the Second Great Awakening, where they believed the second coming of Christ had already occurred, right? And he believed that humans were no longer obliged to follow the moral rules of the past, and that all residents within the Oneida community were married to each other, and that they carefully regulated free love. So again, he was sort of a hippie, one of the first hippie groups, so to speak. It's an off branch of the Quakers, so to speak, as well. And that's another good way to define it. But his Oneida community created this idea of perfectionist and rejected traditional ideas of family and marriage, and they wanted to raise children all together. So, totally different, not always accepted by others. All right. Now, there are going to be some other utopian communities, secular utopian communities. One is going to be focused on individual freedom, spontaneity, with self-fulfillment, and then the other ones are the demands of community life, and where you have discipline and organizational hierarchy. All right. For example, George Ripley creates the Brook Farm in Massachusetts. Robert Owen, who is also a utopian socialist, creates this village of cooperation. And together, the whole point of it is to create a community that would permit full opportunity for self-realization. Everybody shared everything. Really, this is pre-Karl Marx utopian society. Everybody would be together. All right. Here are Robert Owen's plans for New Harmony Village. And here's kind of what it looked like in 1832. All right, we'll stop right there.